So that brings us to designing your food forest. Let's call it a 10-step process, or Bo's 10-step process. So these are some design elements that I think we should consider. So these we're just going to go through like a checklist. Did I consider these elements in my design? Number one, we're going to go through access. How do I move around? 2, paths. I need to create paths. I have to typically want to design in some form of focal point. That means like if I do walk around this path, am I going to put a bench there? Maybe there's a Buddha statue. Maybe I put in a water feature. Maybe I have my beehive there so you can see the beehives, things like this. We need to think about habitat features for animals. So it's not just about growing food for us, it's also about having habitat for what we call our facilitators. Facilitators are animals within the ecosystem that do work for us, whether that's worms, bees, right? These are facilitators. They're pollinating my food forest. I need to provide habitat. I need to understand the sun angle so I can space my trees properly. I have to understand the slope of the property because that will also change the spacing. We can look at the water drainage, whether we need to put in swales or not if we have overland water flow, for instance. That also is always dictating our tree spacing. After that, we look at the tree and the use. Do you like this tree and for what purpose? And then the tree expansion over time, which is understanding the concept of polycultures, okay, or what I like to term as expanding polycultures because we have this time relationship. So let's design a food forest. This is a square that you guys were in. Next to my garden, there is a square. The low or number 3 access is where we walked in to go cut down the banana, right? The other 2 access points are from the kitchen and from the center of the garden. 3 paths access that food forest, okay? And the rest has fences. So that's it. I've maximized my access. How can I get into that food forest? Where are my access points? First step. So next step, I need to lay out pathways, okay? So how would I lay out a pathway? Well, when I did this, it's just plowed land. There was nothing. There's no trees. There's nothing. I have my garden, and I have the square. That's all there was. And I know where the access is because there's a nursery, the kitchen, and the garden. But that's all I have, right? So I got a garden hose. Very simple tool. Get a garden hose. It's normally pretty long, right? And I went from this point, and I laid out the garden hose on a nice sinuous curve. So from number 1, I laid the garden hose to number 3. And then, now that I laid it out in a nice curve, just out in the middle of a field, right? That's all I have. I had lemongrass. So I planted lemongrass next to the hose. And then I could pick up the hose. And I moved it over 2 meters. And I laid out the next curve. So from 1 to 2. Planted lemongrass. So when I finish, all I have is lemongrass paths. So I denote the paths. Now that I have denoted pathways, right? And for me, I just used a garden hose, and we have a clumping grass here, which is nice, lemongrass, because it's a nice clumping grass. It can denote edge, also very edible and sellable. So Lynn's aunt comes and harvests lemongrass every year from our property, sells it in the market so she can make income, so that's nice. And we get as much as we want to eat, so that's also nice. So next thing, that gives me zones. So I start to see that I have different zones, right? So zone 1, zone 2, 3, 4, and 5, and I create a little focal point in the center, that little opening. So I could walk through there and create some type of focal point if I want. So now that I have zones, I have to see the spatial relationship of trees. So this tip, lay it out starting at one edge. So I'm going to start at a corner and just work my way across. So there's my focal point. Assume I want to design in this garden a little pond, a water feature, a fountain, some type of habitat, whatever you want. Others, maybe I want to have a beehive or another little pond. Any of these features are up to you. What would you like? But this is how we would look at designing it. So I've laid out some different habitat features depending on what type of animals I may want to interact in my farm. So at that point, I've got that, but I haven't laid out any trees. I don't know where to space the trees. So I have to pick which trees I want, but I have to understand the sun angle of the tree. So here we can see that as trees are taller, the angle of shade would be different, correct? So through the growing cycle and through different times of year, so we can see the summer and winter sun have different angles. So in the winter, the sun is very low and casts a long shadow. But in the summer, the sun is very high and you get a short shadow. So here, I can calculate the shadow's length just by using geometry, but easily, you could just put a stick in your yard and measure that also just by watching the different through a period of 1 year. So you need to know, in order to do this, the height, the mature height, and the diameter of the tree that you want to plant. So if you say, I want to plant a mango tree, well, I look up in my chart and it says a mango tree can get to 6 meters tall. Okay. But how wide is a mango tree? And you know what's sad? They don't write how wide the mango tree is. But they show me a picture of a mature mango tree. So how would I, if I know and I see a picture that the mango tree is 6 meters, how do I know how wide it is? I could use a ruler, put on my computer, and if 6 meters equals 1 inch, then I turn it side, oh, now it's 4 meters. So I just get a ratio, right? So I don't need to know exactly. So now I know it's about 4 meters diameter, 6 meters tall. Cool. So I write all those down for each of the trees that I want to plant. I have a list of height and width. So now I have to think about my goals. What type of fruit and vegetable relationship do you want to have in your food forest? Everyone is different. Some person might want to have 100% fruit. Well, we call that an orchard. Only fruit, no vegetables, right? But what if you had a food forest? It may be considered by some people to be like 50-50. 50% fruit and 50% vegetables. Okay? Or, for instance, you could have 50% fruit, 50% vegetables, but that's a food forest versus a forest garden, and that means the spacings are different, right? Remember, they're at different latitudes. So both could have the same relationships, but they produce differently. And our garden, well, typically in our gardens, from what we classify, if we want to think about fruits, not like tomatoes, but fruit trees, right? We're not going to see that we have any trees. We don't put trees in our garden. We just have vegetables. Well, here's a relationship to your garden, no trees. Our orchard, no vegetables. Food forest, maybe half and half. So this gives us diversity and production, right? So the diversity of fruit can be increased by placing our trees. So depending on how close you put it, you get more fruit. Further away, more vegetables. Very easy. And the vegetable, inversely, is changing with the fruit relationship. And we can also play with another thing if you don't have a lot of space, as I discussed when we were doing our grafting, right? If I put in a dwarf tree, it doesn't take up as much space, right? So I could put in more dwarf trees to increase my variety if I don't have enough space, right? So if I want diversity of fruits, dwarf trees might be a very good option for you. So here's how that's going to work. I've got my sun angle. I have my fruit and vegetable relationship. If it's an orchard is based on this ratio, a quarter diameter spacing. If you put the mature tree and it gets too close where they start to touch, it will lower the yield of the fruit. So you have to let there be a space. At a quarter space, you will have maximum fruit and almost no vegetables. Okay? So if you want to increase the relationship of vegetables under the fruit tree, you have to increase the space between the trees. Okay? You see the sunlight coming down? So at a quarter spacing, the tree gets all the sunlight, but under the tree, there's no light. That's why when you go in an orchard, normally it barely even grows grass. It's like no grass. It doesn't get enough sunlight to grow grass. And if vegetable is grass, right, in the second level succession, and there's not enough light to grow grass, well, for sure you can't grow vegetables, right? So if I want to, increase that spacing. So here we see that. So lay out your orchard in a triangle. Why would I want to lay it in a triangle? The triangle fits more space. More trees will fit in a triangle than in a grid. Okay? So when they're a grid, there's an opening in the middle. A triangle would be more closed, and I can open the triangle. So this would be more of a relationship, the spacing of a fruit to vegetable relationship. If I had 50% fruit, right? 50% vegetables, do you see how the sun angle is now able to get under the tree? Right? So it's going into the tree, where before it was too closed and the sun was not allowed to go under. It hit the second fruit tree. But now there's enough space, so that 45-degree angle will come in, and now I can get and grow vegetables or herbs under the fruit tree. So in this instance, that's working out really nice. So we have this sun angle, which is a vegetable to fruit relationship. If we increase the diameter even more, our vegetable to fruit relationship would go up. But do you notice that the sun angle changed? So this is in the tropics, right? We go back. I have a very high sun angle, so I don't need to have as much space to get the relationship of 50-50. But in a temperate climate, the sun angle is lower, so I have to have more space to get the same relationship of 50% vegetables to fruits, for instance. Okay? You don't have as much light. So how does that work in relationship to a garden? Right? So here's my garden, all laid out, full sunlight, right? And if I have maximum sunlight, I have to turn up maximum water because the plant is hot. Give me water. So I have to have maximum water because I have maximum sunlight to get maximum growth. Well, that's what we do in vegetable gardening. But in our others, you make a decision. How can I put my garden in my forest? And that's the relationship to the trees. So full sunlight, no trees. Dapple sunlight, vegetables and trees. This is just basically what's going on. Slope will make a difference. So if I have property, I now know that there's the angle of the sun that changes, but the property's angle can change also. Correct? So if I come over here and I look at this and I have the light, it casts a shadow. But if I pick the table up, the shadow gets shorter. So I can, on a sloped property, plant my trees closer together because I have the angle, which is represented here. Dependent on the degree of slope represents closer spacings because the angle of the sun is fixed. So put the tallest trees in your design in the back, away from the sun. Because if you put your tall trees first, they will shade the short trees. So now we have another triangle. My short trees close and my tall trees in the back, again representing a triangle. And maximize any sun angle relationships. This is the major key point. Understanding the relationship of these sun angles to tree spacings will maximize the relationship of your desired fruit to vegetables. Then you pick what vegetables you want and what trees you want, okay? So after I've done that, I need to think about water or drainage. I need to understand where the water is coming into my property, and if it's too much slope, how would I slow it down? So I could put swales. So assume this property has a very high slope or angle. I could put in swales. Now I'm showing that overland water flow. Okay, so you can lay out with that hose if it tipped. So now we look at this tree spacing patterns that we could choose. We could do squares, which is a typical orchard, or we could use triangles. And this is giving you the idea of a square, creates a square within a square. But when I do a triangle or a hexagon, right, I get that smaller angle. But when I do that and I expand the trees, that triangle gets bigger. So I particularly believe that in a food forest or forest gardening situation, we would use the triangular, or I describe as hexagonal pattern, and then expand the hexagon to get the maximum sunlight. Okay? So triangular spacings will allow you to have 15% more trees per acre than a grid spacing. So here we go. I got to start somewhere. So I've laid out my edges. I now have my zoning, and I start in and I pick my first tree. So I say, oh, my first tree I want to plant is mango. So I go and I look at the diameter of the mango, right? And I put it in the corner. Boom, first tree, number one, right in the corner. Then I say, well, next to the mango, maybe I'll put in a jackfruit. So I have to go and look at the jackfruit, and the jackfruit diameter is not the same as the mango. The mango is wider. So now I have to have that spacing, minimum spacing, in relationship to the diameter of two different trees, right? And then I place that, and then I can do the third one. So dependent on my trees, the place is a triangle between those three trees. So the first three trees make a triangle, and I just keep walking that triangle throughout the design based on just picking different trees so that it'd be mixed, and mixed orchard based on that. So there we go. We have the 7 layers of our food forest. We've got our canopy, which is going to be represented by our standard fruit trees, or any large nuts, trees, oaks, pecans. After that, we can create a sub-canopy. That could be semi-dwarf fruit trees, things like sugar maples, anything like this, smaller dwarf fruit trees. After that, I can put in a shrub layer. That could be any dwarf fruit trees, service trees, pawpaws, hazels, anything like that. I can have a brush layer, or a herbaceous or large herbaceous, which could be currants, brambles, chokeberries, anything like that, moringas. We have grass, any type of canes could be things, pawpaws, lemongrass, bamboos. You have your herbaceous, which could be your comfreys, asparagus, artichoke, sage. You get your rhizosome, which is in the ground, the rhizophyre. At that point, we have root crops, artichokes, anything like that. I now come in, I put ground covers. That could be nasturtium, strawberry, thyme, and or mint. And we could have climbers and vines, which could be represented from grapes, passion fruits, arbors, kiwis, any of these vines. So we have 7 layers that we can work with within this zoning. So remember, the tree diameter dictates the spacing requirement within that design. So if we look at a food forest, it's interesting that we can do this, but what can we do with all of these trees and plants? What do we do with these things, right? So I could have fruit production, right? Edible flowers, oils, alcohol, insulation, charcoal, roofs, tool handles. I could add flavors to my foods through herbs, animal fodder, wildlife fodder. I could have crafts that I use it to make crafts, arts and crafts, fibers for my clothing. I could fix nitrogen. I could just have fun within my food forest. I could have an edible landscaping. I have nut production, edible leaf production, any other essential oils, syrups or sugars, firewood, timber for my home, pole construction for my barns. I can provide my medicine, spices, bee fodder. I could build furniture, dyes, soil stabilizers, resins, windbreaks, stream stabilization, and the list could go on and on. All of the products that can be available in your forest. But then you would go in your local area and look at what trees, right, what species are available in your area and what they could do for you. So I go through, and that's how I start to, the fun part of permaculture, is to start to research the trees and plants that you can grow in your home, in your area. And then you start to derive a more intimate relationship with the particular types of trees, right? How does it grow? Can I eat it? How do I propagate it, right? What is the nature of this tree and how can I work with it? So then I have a relationship, it becomes my friend. I know about this tree. I know about this plant. I know what it can provide for me, and I know what I need to do for it in order for it to do that. So I create its habitat. I maintain its habitat. I become a steward. There's a symbiosis relationship between understanding what's wrong with this tree or plant, because I can look at deficiencies and say, well, you know, it got sunburnt, right? Because it was in the sun, didn't have access to enough water. So these are the type of things where I can then come and say, well, I can do something or not do something about that, right? These are relationships that you can form. So let's look at polycultures and how my food forest is going to expand over time, which I like to say is an expanding polyculture. So in the year 1, my seedlings are really small. They may only have a stalk the size of my finger, and it's only 1 meter tall. It's going to be very, very small. So represented in a circle, really, really small circles. And if I've done my design correctly and I planted them at their maximum diameters, right, plus the spacing, they're going to be very far apart. I might have one tree here and another tree 3 or 4 meters apart and nothing between them. What do I do between the trees when they're young? I can grow more vegetables. I can grow ground covers. I can grow herbs. I can grow, what if I had a pumpkin patch? My pumpkins are not going to hurt my fruit tree, right? So I can grow pumpkins. These are all these things. So think about something I can do is more of a cash crop. So I can cash crop between my trees. So in a business situation, I need money. Right? Everybody does. So I can have my cash crop, and annuals may perform that. But in a longer term investment sense, I want my tree to not have to do so much work to get my money. So for the 3 to 5 years, I have to do more annuals, which requires work as cash crops, right? But in the 5th year, my fruits give me more income with less work. This is really also what this is about. The affiliation to that type of agricultural system, monoculture, has a big affiliation with lots of work. And that's really nice if you can use fossil fuels, right? And you have access to a lot of capital to buy big tractors. But if you don't, or in the future, we don't have access to that much energy, that type of agricultural system is not going to be very productive if you take away the fossil fuels. Do those big landscapes and don't have tractors that run on fossil fuels. How's that going to work? They currently estimate that the calorific calorie, 1 calorie, that's what we derive energy of corn, takes 10 calories of fossil fuel to make 1 calorie of food. Do you think that's a sustainable number? We have to make 10 calories of energy to make 1 calorie of food? And we have to take it from the ground and burn it to create carbon? That's not really sustainable. And that's what this is really getting to. So we look at it. Year 3, it's expanding. I'm going to get less vegetables, but I still have some cash crop, right? I still have food, and I'm waiting on my trees. By year 5, I basically have a full developed food forest where I'm getting 50% of my income or food source is from my fruits with little to no work. And the other, for my family, I can derive my vegetables. So I don't have to buy vegetables, and I have fruits in surplus. This is this balance of relationship. So how's that look? Here's year one, quarter gap spacing. In year one, 90% of this area is in vegetables. 10% is in fruit tree, but I don't get any yield, so I put that as 0. 0 yield, fruit. 90% vegetable. Year 3, 70% vegetable, 0% fruit. But year 5, I might have 60% fruits and only 30% vegetables, because I may not desire to have 50-50. I may desire to only grow enough vegetables for my family, right? Because I have to work to make those, and it's not economical for me to sell them. At Raktamachat, I will not sell vegetables. I will not grow any systems that will sell a vegetable in the market. I don't deem it to be ethical. I believe everyone should grow their own vegetables. That's the problem. The monoculture situations that are creating these annuals, right, is the unsustainable practice. We should all have the right to have a garden. The biggest problem in the world right now is that it's not an inherent right, like in a constitution, for everybody that's born to have the right to have their own land for a garden. Think about that right. How do you not have a right to grow your own food? Yeah? That would be more important. So I think we should grow our own food. And then this other way of getting these other types of fruits and nuts to provide our calories right could be done in a different way. This just gives you a relationship. So a tip is legumes with other yields. Remember, look at if I'm going to use legumes, which are really great for fixing nitrogen, can I have legumes that will give me things other than nitrogen? Like, for instance, the moringa or any other, just lots of them. And preference for any multifunctional species. A species that can do more than one thing. Don't get stuck in that one aspect. So here's our polycultures. We turn them sideways. We look at them in triangles, right? So we now start to see that if the sun is on this side and the tree makes shade, we're not going to get much production on the backside, right? It's going to be in shade. Yeah? So our polyculture is not actually a concentric circle. It's an oval. And we put the path into the shade. So here we see the path behind the tree, and the opening is where my garden is. So our polyculture creates a triangle, which is more like an oval, right? So polycultures are expanded with the increase of the tree diameter each year, underlining the crown's drip line. So as the tree gets bigger, it gets bigger in height and bigger in diameter, and I can fit larger understory herbaceous trees under, and I expand the polyculture out. This is called the concept of the expanding polyculture. So what does that kind of look like? Here's my path, so I can access to my garden, or food forest, so I can harvest things. But my path is on the back side of the sun angle. So the sun is coming this way. I have full sunlight. The tree is shading the path. Okay? Very different. Year one. Kind of looks like that. Very small fruit tree. Doesn't take up any space. Lots of vegetables. Year 3. The fruit tree is getting bigger. Vegetables, okay? So there's a balance of fruits to vegetables. By year 6, the fruit tree is almost at its mature size in relationship to vegetables. And how does that look? Well, year 1, very small. Year 3, a little bit more going on. By year 5, more closed canopy, but still enough sunlight. So this is what's going to take place. And this is how, when we're designing, we pick where we're going to put certain trees in relationship to their height, their diameter, our relationship, and a sun angle. This is the things I need to know as an engineer, per se, or an agronomist. I want to be a food forester. That's how I'm going to look at this. So, other ways that we can play with shapes. This may be in a temperate climate. I have a strong north wind. The wind is coming down. It's blasting me. So I could put in a hedgerow. So you see the hedgerow protecting my fruit forest, because I live in a temperate climate where they have these strong northerly winds or southerly winds, right? So use hedgerows for protection from wind and or extreme temperatures. So that's very interesting.